The stupid mustache stays until being a pretty boy is no longer illegal. Yes, that also includes the chin strap beard. I'm holding my face ransom until we get some justice around here. Speaking of pretty boys being illegal, after the most recent election, there has been a lot of talk about abortion and reproductive rights, and for good reason. And with the topic of abortion, there is inevitably talk about what there is to be done once a person has been forced to give birth, and now there is just this unwanted child in the world. Across the board, from conservatives to liberals to even a few leftists, the word adoption has been thrown around as sort of a gotcha to the other side. For instance, a conservative will say, no, don't abort the baby. Just give birth to the baby and then put it up for adoption. It's a good alternative to, killing the baby. There are many families waiting for a chance to adopt. For liberals and some unfortunate leftists, the stock argument is, well, if you care so much about babies, why aren't you adopting the babies that don't have families in the system? Are you going to adopt the babies that are born? That's what I thought. I'm here to say, once again, that every single one of you are wrong. Extremely wrong, even. The adoption and foster care systems, especially in the United States, are human trafficking schemes working in broad daylight, and they definitely are not your solution to the abortion debate. Both of my parents were adopted. My father was fostered so that his adoptive parents could siphon money from the state up until they essentially almost had to adopt him when his birth mother finally died. Of course, after getting all that sweet, sweet government money. My mother was a product of teenage pregnancy, and this teenage girl was told that she died while my mom was then being human trafficked to a admittedly very naive and not knowing what was going on my grandmother, adoptive grandmother. These are not one-off cases. All adoption comes from a place of trauma. The foundation of modern adoption in the United States is rooted in trauma as well. Listen, if I relate to you the entire history of adoption throughout multiple cultures, this video would be 10 hours long. I don't have time for that, and neither do you. I will be focusing on the United States as that's what I'm well acquainted with, but just know that a lot of these points that I'm making are in fact able to be applied to other cultures. I'm just focusing on the United States because United States evil, rah. Anyways, the origin of the phrase put up for adoption actually comes from the orphan trains that were ran in the United States between 1854 and 1929. A man named Charles Loring Brace did see that a bunch of eastern cities in the United States, like New York, had a orphan problem, an abandoned children epidemic. In 1850, New York City had 30,000 orphaned, abandoned, or otherwise neglected children alone, just in that one city. So it was a problem, and they were running amok, as you will. Charles decided that the best course of action was to load these children onto trains and ship them to the rural Midwest to find permanent families for them, aka so those families have more children to labor traffic. He thought the hard manual labor that these kids would do would benefit them in the long run. So he was labor trafficking children and calling it a good thing. I wonder what was happening in the United States between 1853 and 1910 that would warrant labor trafficking children and banning abortion in the United States. The enslaved peoples were freed. That's what happened. And they were banning abortion because they needed kids to exploit and work on their farms. So it always goes back to slavery with the United States, I'm finding. A lot of stuff. goes back to slavery and or racism against black people. If you really care about learning true history of the United States, that's what you'll find often. Here's an excerpt from adoption.org. Before an orphan train arrived in a city, advertisements were sent out, and families waited for them to arrive. Some children were even matched with families before the trains arrived in that city. As the trains pulled into the station, people interested in adopting children would line up. At some of the nicer stops, children were ushered into a theater, opera house, town hall, or school, and put up on a stage to perform, recite poems, or sing for the prospective adoptive families. At some of the worst stops, children were put up on stumps or blocks for invasive inspection. So the good option is still horrifying. What do you mean children were put on stage to dance like circus monkeys in the hopes that a family would labor traffic them? And that is opposed to being invasively inspected on a stump. How horrifying. I sure hope they don't do that today.
If you think America is the heart of modern civilization, this story will surely change your mind. There, a trade in unwanted children exists, and the way they do it is distressing. It's known as rehoming, and when parents decide they no longer want their adopted child, they simply advertise them on websites to lure prospective new parents. It's as straightforward as getting rid of an old fridge on eBay. There's no vetting or court orders required, and these disposable children can be handed over to anyone. In fact, until you see it, it's difficult to believe, and we should warn you, it's quite confronting.
First up, we have Alicia. Alicia is a very special and very sweet young lady who is looking for her forever family. She describes herself
It's a parade like no other. Abandoned children desperately selling themselves to win over a new family, a new start.
Anyways, this was only one of the first stepping stones into developing the $25 billion child trafficking industry known as adoption today in the United States. There are many notable names in the building of the modern adoption industry, like Dr. Thomas Hicks, who illegally sold 200 babies in the 50s and 60s through his clinic in Georgia. There's also Gertrude Pitcairn, who kidnapped and sold babies through her midwifery job in Montana. This happened in the 1920s. But I think the most notable name in the founding of the modern United States adoption industry is Georgia Tann. People will refer to her as the founder of modern adoption, and she definitely was the blueprint for the shady practices that we engage in today. In 1922, Georgia used her father's political connections to gain an executive secretary position at the Memphis branch of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, which was a chain of orphanages. By 1929, Georgia had appointed herself the executive director. Using her position at this chain of orphanages, it's thought that Georgia kidnapped and sold over 5,000 babies and children to wealthy families for a steep profit. This woman stole children from hospitals, schools, playgrounds, you name it. She kidnapped children from poor neighborhoods from the street, as she knew that the families did not have the social or economic means to fight her. She created a legal black market for children, even ran ads in newspapers to sell children. And what's so upsetting about this is it wasn't just her that was facilitating this. She had judges, she had, doctors, she had powerful political allies that helped her do this. A baby was born in the hospital. One of her doctor allies would, tell the mother that the baby died, give it to Georgia. Georgia sells the baby. She had judges in her network. The judge would tell her when there was a widower or a poor mother that was in the court. The judge would help her kidnap the baby or the child, sell the child, profit. It's estimated that this woman made $1 million trafficking children in the 21 years her business ran, which is $11 million today, by the way. And that's not all, believe it or not. Georgia's orphanages were rife with abuse, neglect, and pedophilia. Georgia herself would molest little girls, and the male caretakers would rape and molest the little boys. Surprise, surprise, Georgia was big on eugenics, and any babies that were like disabled or that she found ugly that wouldn't sell well, she would neglect a lot of them until they died. She would often take newborns from the hospitals too soon, like even an hour after they were born, and then put them in her nurseries. However, the nurseries did not have adequate medical attention, and those babies would die under her care because she took them too soon. Survivors from her orphanages would talk about how they were like burned with cigarettes. Some would talk about how they would force their head underwater in the bathtub to like threaten them with drowning as a means of scaring them. The exact number of children that died under Georgia's care is just an estimate. We don't know for sure, but at least 500. At least 500 died of neglect and mistreatment. And truthfully, I could keep going. There is so much about this case that is so fucking horrific, and I left so many details out of it that I genuinely would recommend, like, going down the rabbit hole and researching. I'll link a video that you can watch that goes more in depth about the situation. This video is a summary of the entire situation. Talking about the woes of adoption could be a 10-hour series, truthfully. The authorities of Memphis finally put her operation under scrutiny, and they got her shut down in the 1950s. And just because Georgia's operation got shut down does not mean that her practices vanished in midair. This is a lucrative industry, and we are talking about the United States. One thing Georgia did tap into was the eugenics and cultural genocide part of the adoption industry. She would, and this is quite sickening, she would, kidnap those kids from poor neighborhoods. Some of them were not white. And she would advertise these children to say, like, hey, help these poor kids assimilate into whiteness. Yeah, so the United States government saw that and went, that's cool, actually. I like that, which is insane. But in 1985, the Bureau of Indian Affairs created the Indian Adoption Project. Social workers were enlisted to go onto reservations and justify the removal of Native children from their homes with dubious and unfounded excuses. Additionally, Indigenous families were stripped of any rights to regain custody or even see their children through social workers' reports that were supported by state and federal child welfare systems. Estimates from government agencies suggest that between 25 and 35% of all Native children were stolen from their homes and communities in the 1960s. Of these children, an estimated 85% were often adopted into non-Native families to further the government's goal of assimilation. These estimates have been confirmed by the National Indian Child Welfare Association and the New York Times. The goal was cultural genocide. They wanted to strip these indigenous children of their native languages and cultures in an effort to assimilate them into a white United States. And unlike Georgetown, this kidnapping was state mandated. And when it's not state mandated by the United States government, it's encouraged by foreign governments. Two of the most notable examples of this are China and South Korea, who had programs to encourage the trafficking of their children to primarily white and wealthy countries in Europe and, of course, the United States. South Korea is one of the countries that is most responsible for international adoption. They had the first and largest transnational adoption program, and about 200,000 babies were thought to have been adopted out of South Korea. And the origins of this adoption program was based in ethno-nationalism. After the Korean War, there was a surplus of interracial children due to the United States having been stationed in South Korea. In an ethno-nationalistic surge to make Korea stronger, rebuild the country, they had a small concerted effort to basically adopt those children back to the United States. This small and contained effort to ship out undesirables escalated quite quickly. Korea then opened this adoption program to full Korean children so that they could traffic their impoverished and needy children out of the country to wealthy countries like the United States. And once again, an effort to rebuild their country. They were selling children to make money to rebuild their country. Selling children as a commodity for profit is human trafficking. They did not give a fuck though. And because they were making money off of these children, the Korean government then started to falsify abandonment claims. There were three different things that you could mark a child when putting them up for adoption. One of them was orphaned. There was another one I forgot. And then there's a third option, which was abandoned. This is a very open-ended checkbox. And if by abandoned, the South Korean government meant kidnapped and sold to wealthy countries through a human trafficking scheme, you would be correct. During the one child policy era, China had similar issues with trafficking children, selling these children out of the country, and it had a additional misogynistic aspect to it. I'd like to say the adoption of little girls out of China is the less uglier cousin of just straight up femicide, because that was the option. It was ship your little girls out of China through a human trafficking scheme or femicide. And on top of all of this, these Asian babies were shipped, human trafficked even, out of these countries to primarily white countries in Europe and, of course, the United States. But Nicholas, what's the problem with transracial adoption? The same problem I have with white families adopting native children. It's cultural genocide. You're trying to assimilate them into a white culture. You're withholding them from their culture, their language, things that, these white families definitely are not trying to keep them in touch with. Most importantly, you very much run the risk of putting that child in a racist white family. Whether that be the immediate family or extended family, you put that child at risk. Not only is there a risk of that child being put in a racist family, but there is most definitely a risk of putting that child in a family that has a white savior complex that essentially treats the child like a toy or like a product to make them look better. It's the equivalent of, those white Christian missionaries going to African countries and then taking photos with impoverished black children to make them feel better. If a white family is to adopt a child from a different cultural background, the best thing they can do is keep that child in touch with that culture and their traditions, but they don't. So, in fact, I do have a couple accounts that I ran into while I was initially delving into this topic. I was probably as defensive as you're getting right now until I sat down, shut the fuck up, and I did my research, and the facts defeated my feelings. Melissa Gita Richards, otherwise known as Dopty_thoughts on Instagram, was adopted into an Italian Portuguese American household. And she was not told she was actually Colombian or adopted until she was 19. And by then, her father had already instilled very racist ideas of Latinos into her head.
Racism was so normalized in my white adoptive family that I would call my Latino boyfriend in high school a spick. And I didn't even bat an eye because that wasn't the worst thing that I heard about Latinos. And I'm Latino. I'm Colombian. My parents adopted me from Colombia when I was a baby. But the thing is, they adopted me and completely whitewashed me into only representing their culture. So to them, I wasn't one of those people.
And another account I'll direct you to, because she had a lot of resources I used to educate myself, was Desiree, or the outspoken adoptee on Instagram. Her adoptive mother basically custom ordered a baby with peanut butter skin and curly hair, which is insane and also race fetishization, clearly. And if all of this information is not enough for you, here are some abuse stats. Children residing in households with adults unrelated to them were 8 times more likely to die of maltreatment than children in households with 2 biological parents. Risk of maltreatment or death was also elevated for children residing with step, foster, or adoptive parents and in households with other adult relatives present. Risk of maltreatment or death was not increased for children living with only one biological parent. A Johns Hopkins University study of a group of foster children in Maryland found that children in foster care are 4 times more likely to be sexually abused than their peers not in this setting, and children in group homes are 28 times more likely to be abused. An Oregon and Washington state study determined that almost 1/3 of foster children reported abuse by a foster parent or another adult in the home. Researchers of a study of investigations of abuse in New Jersey foster homes concluded that no assurances can be given that any foster child in the state is safe. More than half of child sex trafficking victims recovered through FBI raids across the U.S. in 2013 were from foster care or group homes. A reported suicide attempt were 4 times greater in adoptees compared with non-adoptees. After adjustment for factors associated with suicidal behavior, the odds of reporting a suicide attempt were reduced, but remained significantly elevated. But, Nicholas, a lot of those stats were for foster care. Well, it should be noted that the adoption industry, and foster care are uh, intertwined. You can't separate them. A lot of the issues that I pose with adoption, I also pose those same issues with foster care and that industry. Of the 53,500 children and youth who were adopted in 2021, 55% were adopted by their foster parents. Clearly intertwined and cannot be separated are the foster care and adoption systems. While I couldn't find, a specific stat that states that the foster care children that were adopted out of the system are the ones specifically at risk for abuse, the stats are still there saying that the foster care system is, dangerous for these kids, obviously. And yet you see that more than 50% of them have been adopted out of that system into families. And if you take into account that half of the United States basically says that a child doesn't need to consent to their own adoption until age 14, and then the other half of the United States either says 10 or 12. To me, that tells me a whole lot of children are being adopted without their consent into families that may not be so awesome. They're getting adopted without their consent in an industry where the government basically funds their abuse. And for the last half of the video, I address your burning questions. Well, Nicholas, what's the alternative? Not selling children, that's for fucking sure. I will link Desiree's website because I think it is a great tool for people that do actually want to do the work and delve into the facts. It will have a detailed explanation of what the alternatives are. It's very succinct. I'll play her video here. Instead of fostering or adopting, we should be working to support families. Instead of, kidnapping children and then the government pays the potentially abusive foster care parents to take those kids in that didn't need to be taken in the first place, especially if, the issue was a money issue. Or even worse, allowing a rich couple to essentially buy your child. Yeah, I think we should be, more focused on supporting the families and giving, general community support to a lot of things that could prevent this from happening. Prevention, the thing that the United States hates. And listen, if all else fails, legal guardianship is still an option. What is the difference between adoption and legal guardianship, you ask? Adoption in the US essentially falsifies your birth certificate. They administer a new birth certificate upon being adopted with your adoptive parents' names on it, and then they seal the real and correct one in the records for up to 99 years. You don't have to like your biological parents or even see them as your parents. Not putting the person that actually birthed you on your birth certificate is falsifying documents. You need to know who births you, if possible, so that you can have access to important cultural information, but not just that, even more important, health information. At this time, while I do know the maternal family of my mother and the maternal biological family of my father, we don't know the paternal families. They could have cancer risk, they could have diabetes risk, heart disease risk, I don't know. And that risk just kind of hangs over our heads, except we don't know what risk it is because we don't know them. We don't need to falsify documents. You can just have legal guardianship over the child without completely falsifying their original birth certificate. This legal guardianship should be with a friend, a godparent, somebody close to the community if possible, just doing our best to keep the children in their communities. Well, Nicholas, what's the alternative if someone's infertile or gay? It's simple, really. You're not entitled to a child. Adoption is not a family building tool. If you have to buy a baby like you would buy a dog, you deserve to go babyless. Children are not objects or toys for adult fulfillment. They are real individuals. So either your family or your friends have a situation and you just end up as a legal guardian, or you go babyless. Sorry. But Nicholas, what about found family? Listen, I had that thought for about 2 seconds. And then I went, wait, that's fucking stupid. Why would that change anything? Because the children that are being adopted don't really consent to that. So how is that found family if they have not chosen the family? Be so fucking for real right now. Kids deserve to have some sort of autonomy over these situations if possible. It's not found family if you were basically human trafficked into that family. If a child has a good experience being adopted and has decided to found family their adoptive family, whatever, that's cool. They can do that. Children should get to have that choice. But Nicholas, what if a child has a good experience being adopted? Fantastic. Good for them. That does not overwrite the experiences of those that have had bad experiences being adopted. It also does not change the fact that the industry is a human trafficking industry. That does not change the history of ethnic cleansing tied to the adoption industry. In fact, I'm happy my mother ended up with her adopted parents. I think her biological family, which we met in 2014, suck. And I think she's in a better situation. That does not change the fact that a teenage girl was still told that her baby died, while said baby was then sold to a admittedly naive and didn't know any better and didn't know that the teenage girl was told that the baby died woman and sold. My mother was sold. My mother having a good experience in her adoptive home does not change that. The adoption industry is not some altruistic venture for a white Christian family. It's not a family building tool for somebody who's infertile. It is a $25 billion child human trafficking industry. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they're banning abortion. While there isn't a foster care kid shortage, there is an adoptable newborn baby shortage. There aren't any estimates exactly, at least from any sources that I could verify. Some sources say for every one potential adoptive child, there's 36 parents that are willing to adopt. Some sources say that 1 to 2 million adoptive parents are waiting for a potential baby to adopt. What I will say, and something that is verifiable, is that the wait to adopt a child is several years. So that tells me what I need to know to verify those claims. The banning of abortion in certain states was definitely not for the pro-life lie that they actually give a fuck about children. They just want to fuel the $25 billion adoption industry that currently lacks product. Believe it or not, this is an introductory video to this topic. I had to summarize so much. If I put every detail I wanted to in this video, it could easily have been 3 hours long after I edited it. I do suggest you go down the rabbit hole, you do your own research. I'll give you some places to start. I would go to Melissa and Desiree's pages for a place to start as well. I know Melissa wrote a book. You can go support her. And I know Desiree was diagnosed with breast cancer. So if you wanted to go support her as well as going through some of her resources that she's provided, that would be lovely as well. I would recommend that. She even has a place you can donate to her to help her out with the payments for the breast cancer treatment. Anyways, adoption is not your fucking solution to abortion, you human trafficker.